My name's Alex Edmans. I'm a Professor of Finance at London Business School, and I specialise in responsible business and corporate governance. And I really appreciate the Global Ethical Finance Initiative giving me the opportunity to speak. So what I'm going to speak about today is there a business case for diversity? And you might think, well, am I seriously asking this question? Right? Because hasn't this question already been answered conclusively many times? So there's various McKinsey reports, and the most recent one, called Diversity Wins, concludes that the business case for gender and ethnic diversity in top teams is stronger than ever. And there's a recent study commissioned by the Financial Reporting Council, which interviewed some chairs, and one of them says, there have been enough reports and statistics and evidence-based research to stop talking about it and get on with it. And another chair talked about who he looks for in terms of board suggestions from executive search firms. I don't want to see any men. I don't care if they're Jesus Christ. I don't want to see them. And these are things that absolutely I'm predisposed to believe as an ethnic minority, as a strong supporter of responsibility and diversity more generally. I would like this to be unambiguous. But then I saw some new research which was really inconvenient. And so this is how it proceeded. A new study has found a strong negative relationship between gender diversity and shareholder value. Over the last 20 years, the percentage of women on FTSE 100 boards has improved by 26% versus 15% for the S&P 500. But in terms of total shareholder returns, for the FTSE 100, it's gone up by only 136, but for the S&P 500, it's gone up by 221%. Commenting on the findings, the lead researcher said, this is the clearest evidence yet that having more women on boards destroys shareholder value. Each additional 10% of female representation costs 75% in shareholder returns. If the UK had gender parity, this would reduce the market value by a cumulative 2.3 trillion pounds. So the whole idea here is that in the UK, gender diversity has gone up by more than the US, and that's why the stock market has done worse. Now, when you read something like that, you get immediately angry. You think this is an offensive study. You try to poke all the holes in it, and there's lots of holes you could poke in this. But there could be so many other reasons for why the US stock market has done well. Nothing to do with gender diversity, so this is really unreliable. But all I'll say is, yes, this is indeed an unreliable study, but the same skepticism that we apply to a study that we don't like, we should also apply to the studies that we do like. Why? Because I will say that unfortunately, many of the studies which are taken for granted as proving the business case for diversity have just as fundamental flaws as this study. So some of you might know that I gave a TED talk a few years ago on confirmation bias. And this is the idea that when we see something we don't like, the part of the brain that lights up is the amygdala, and that's the same part of the brain that lights up when we're attacked by a tiger. So we often respond to evidence in an emotional fight or flight response. If we don't like the evidence, we're immediately defensive. If we like it, we latch onto this. And so we need to be really careful about an issue like diversity, which is important to all of us. It's personally important to me as a minority, but it's important to everybody who cares about responsibility, regardless of your status. But this does mean, because our opinions on this are strong, that we need to tread carefully with the data. And let me just go through one example of one study, just to show you how careful we need to be. And I'm going to choose the recent study commissioned by the Financial Reporting Council. Why? It's the most recent one. It was commissioned by a UK regulator, which does have a history of being really evidence-based. It will always try to make sure that anything it passes is based on research, and therefore commissioned institutions to do the research for them. And one of them was, unfortunately for me, London Business School, some of my colleagues, and it gives me great pain that this study is actually quite flimsy. But my goal as a researcher is to be led only by the science. Regardless of who does it, whether it's my colleague or somebody who I dislike for some reason, I need to apply the same standards. And unfortunately here, this is an example of a study with very weak findings. So what it claims is the following. higher levels of gender diversity positively correlate with better future performance as measured by the EBITDA margin. And not only is that a correlation, but this is also causation. Indeed, they contrast it with prior research. Prior decades, research for decades, hasn't confirmed anything causal. And then they write in bold, these results suggest that gender diverse boards are more effective than those without women. Then the Dean of London Business School writes a foreword saying the academic rigor with which data was collected yields new insights. We all stand to learn from the author's methodology and findings. So not only are the results strong, the results are also particularly well done and rigorous. And indeed, the Leadership Institute, which did the research, said at the foreword, we treated it with the rigor and care of our best scholarly research. And not surprisingly, with such strong findings, which people would like to be true, with such rigor of London Business School, this has led to many people reporting on the study, taking it at face value. And it's not their fault for taking it at face value. The study is over 100 pages. You can't expect everybody to read every single word, so they went with the executive summary. Minerva Analytics, a great research organization, wrote an article, Boardroom Diversity Improves Financial Performance. The Institute for Chartered Accountants of England and Wales wrote an article, The First Line, the case for diverse boards was given further clout after new research published by the FRC. Linklaters, a great law firm I've worked with previously, found that the effort to diversify boards pays benefits in terms of culture and performance. Okay, but all of these statements were made without actually looking at the data. So let's look at what the data actually found. So this is their own claim from the executive summary. Higher levels of gender diversity lead to better financial performance. What is their measure of financial performance? EBITDA margin. One might wonder whether that's actually the good measure. You can improve margins by cutting costs, but let's stand in their corner and use their measure, and let's look at their results. So they did 90 different analyses trying to find a relationship, 6 measures of diversity, over 5 different years of future performance, 3 different sets of firms, so 6 times 5 times 3, 90 different attempts. None of them worked. Not a single one of those regressions were significant, but they wrote in a report for the regulator that this was a positive relationship. And then they had another statement in bold. These results suggest that gender diverse boards are more effective than those without women. Now, they actually had 2 measures of effectiveness. They had not just the EBITDA margin, but they also had total shareholder return. And they conducted 180 tests, of which only 7 were significant out of 180, and 2 were significant in the wrong direction. So basically, they found nothing at all, yet made these very bold claims. And even their results on shareholder returns were wrong because they make a basic error. They just look at capital gains, they ignore dividends, and dividends are a really important part of the return to shareholders. So this shows that we can't take research at face value. So these people were claiming stuff which was not at all supported by the data. And unfortunately, the problem was deeper than just this one study. So what do we want to do in order to look at academic research in general? We don't just do one study, but we look at the research of many studies published in all of the top journals. And this has been done by at least 3 really top scholars. And importantly, if you are somebody who does research in these top journals, you're able to discern the careful research from those which might be less careful. Catherine Klein, who's the Vice Dean of Social Impact at Wharton, where I used to teach, says that research conducted by consulting firms is not as rigorous as peer-reviewed research. The study I just mentioned was not peer-reviewed. That's why they could get away with those statements. Here I dig into the rigorous peer-reviewed studies. Spoiler alert, there is no improvement in performance by having greater diversity. Jesse Fried of Harvard, he looked at the NASDAQ rule, which argues that we need to force minorities to be on the board. And he says, no, rigorous scholarship, much of it by leading female economists, suggests that increasing diversity actually worsens performance. And then Alice Eagley, a psychology professor at Northwestern, asked, well, if the research is so ambiguous, Why is it presented at black and white? Well, there's an obvious appeal in simple claims that diversity improves performance. And this is why you have practitioners and consultants claiming this, and this is why they often will use this in marketing materials. So the rigorous research, if you look at any scholar who's looked at the research in general, this does not show a benefit of diversity. Or does it? Right? Because what I was asked to speak about by GEFI was the business case for diversity. But what is diversity truly? Well, the Financial Conduct Authority in the recent consultation says diversity of thought or cognitive diversity. They refer to different perspectives, abilities, knowledge, attitudes, information styles, and demographic characteristics. But all of the studies that I focused on, they looked at demographic characteristics like ethnicity and gender. And indeed, the FCA itself, while it starts with this, it then presents all of the evidence on demographic characteristics, handpicking a few studies that act in the direction that they want. But that is not true diversity. So even if there is no relationship between demographic characteristics and firm performance, maybe all of these other things do work, do matter, but it's just people have not got data on them. And people care about not diversity, but diversity and inclusion. But this is something that you might actually be able to conduct studies about. And this is something that I did myself about 15 years ago. So I looked at the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. And this is a list which will survey employees at all levels and ask them questions on how it is to work at the company. Credibility, fairness, respect, pride, and camaraderie. And clearly some of these things are not directly related to diversity and inclusion, but some of them are. But you might think if you have a diverse and inclusive culture, yes, you will show greater camaraderie, there will be fairness and there will be respect. So these things are linked to each other. And so what I found was that these companies, which were treating their employees well, which would likely involve D&I, were beating their peers in total shareholder return by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So there is a business case for treating employees well. It's just that that involves far more than just putting a few token minorities on the board to tick a box. Well, it could be that a company does not care at all about how it treats its employees, but just puts a few people on the board to tick a box. It's much harder to create a culture where everybody feels psychologically safe at work, they're able to speak up, they're able to contribute, they feel that their opinions are valued, and that is what's linking to higher performance. Now you might think, well, that's a study that was published 10 years ago. Is this still relevant today? Because there's so much focus on D&I now, maybe as an investor, there's no point investing on D&I, because everybody knows it's important, they're going to take it into account and the returns would have gone away. But interestingly, this study was recently replicated. The replication only came out last week, where not only did they find that the results continue to hold in my time period, but it also still holds until 2020. So in the 10 years since I finished the study, the results are still there. And that might seem shocking. Right, doesn't everybody know that treating employees well matters right now? Shouldn't this already be in the stock price? There should be no investment value of this. But it's linked to the first part of my talk. Right, so the first part of my talk suggested that actually the simple measures of diversity, looking at females or ethnic minorities on the board, doesn't actually capture true D&I. But there are many investors, and there's many others, who will just evaluate the company based on these simple, superficial box-ticking metrics. True diversity inclusion, truly being a great place to work, that is something which is not in the stock price because many people don't actually bother to try to analyze this and gather the data on that. So overall, I would say there is a business case for diversity and inclusion. Well, at the start of my talk, when I presented the negative evidence, you might have thought, why did GEFI invite me here? You might have indeed even switched off your Zoom. But actually, But all that was, even though that research is the most prominent, that research is not about D&I at all. That research is about a few very superficial characteristics. True D&I includes things such as this. And finally, the title was The Business Case for Diversity and Inclusion. But do we even need a business case? Right? Can't there just be an ethical and moral case? So even going back to demographic diversity, which I said there's no business case for, one might think, well, there's a moral case just to include underrepresented minorities, be these women or be these ethnic minorities or be these people with a different sexual orientation. Well, that is differences in terms of demographic diversity. Yes, there is not data showing that we can make more money out of doing that, but maybe making more money was not the reason to do this. Maybe we just think it's the right thing to do. We want to have a board or a workforce which reflects the demographic characteristics of the broader population. Now, do not claim that this is something that's going to make us more money, but just do it because we think that it's the right thing to do, but don't misreport the data as some studies have done. Finally, GEFI asked me to share some of my own experiences of diversity being a minority in two forms, the most obvious being ethnicity, but the second being age. And this is really important, particularly as a professor or somebody involved in, say, policy, where they do make some inferences according to your age as to how your expertise is. And also in terms of discrimination, it's not that you'll have one particular moment where somebody will act in a very hostile way towards you, but a lot of micro moments. And looking at the research by people who do this, this is what is actually really serious. Small micro moments where there are times where people will just do something to make you a little bit less valued. Yes, so there have been times where at London Business School, senior faculty will call me a Chinaman. They'll say, you get your clothes from China. I've actually was born in the UK. I've been to China twice in my life, but let's put that aside. There have been times where I've seen students abused by saying, go back to China, you're full of coronavirus, and people do things like ching chong, ching chong. That is really bad, right? Nothing happens to those people who, even though I have recordings of such behavior. But I think what is more serious is sort of the micro moments rather than overt cases of racism. My first faculty meeting, the faculty have to sign a register just to show that they attended the meeting. So I was sitting in the row of faculty, the person next to me takes the piece of paper, the sign-up sheet, turns to me, and immediately turns behind and gives it to mine, thinking that I'm clearly somebody who cannot possibly be a faculty member. Maybe I'm there to take away their dry cleaning. So, well, what does this mean? It means that because a lot of this is micro moments, these are not things that you can immediately do in terms of reporting them in an easy way. So clearly, if there's a clear case of harassment, that might be something you can trigger something. But with these micro moments, if I was to say, well, this one particular time where the person did not give me the sign-up sheet, then I'd be seen as being a troublemaker, and quite rightly so. But it must be that within these organizations, there should be ways of people who face repeated discrimination in a way of death by 1,000 cuts should feel the opportunity to do that. Because if they don't, then I think you could have a huge lot of human capital, and this can be overshadowed by some superficial effort. When the true assessment of diversity and inclusion is from talking to people, trying to figure out these micro moments of discrimination. That's what's done in surveys such as this. There's other data sources such as the Glassdoor website, but in order to evaluate whether a company is doing well, don't think at, oh, did you put a black square during the issues with Black Lives Matter, or do you give a lot of money to charity, or even how many minorities you're on the board. That's something you can easily deal with, even if you're not truly addressing the issue. But let's get to the grassroots, let's have boots on the ground as to how employees are actually being treated.
There are, I'm sure, lots of thoughts and lots of questions going around everybody's mind now on the back of that presentation. You will note in the chat that the GEFI team have very kindly caught me up with some time in highlighting that there are some hashtags that you can use for social media, but also to ask you now to start thinking about any questions that you might want to pose to the panel as we move forward. And we will be keeping an eye on those, and as it comes to the Q&A, we will pose those. So just to remind everybody, I'm Amy Clarke. I'm the co-founder and chief impact officer at Tribe Impact Capital, and I will be moderating today's session. I have a lot of thoughts going around my head now as a result of Alex's presentation. I'm actually going to hand over now to Gavin Lewis, who is Managing Director at BlackRock and co-founder of the Talk About Black movement. Now, Gavin is actually here today to talk more from an industry perspective than a BlackRock perspective, so reflecting on a lot of his experiences having been in finance. So I'm incredibly excited to welcome Gavin. Gavin, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. One of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to Alex and knowing a lot of the research that he's referencing there is I suppose in many ways, the slightly existential question, which I am going to pose to you, Gavin, and I know you're going to cover. Are we talking about this in the right way? Are we measuring the right things? So Gavin, please, over to you.
Sorry, Amy, you actually froze literally as you posed the question. Can you?
Oh, did I?
Can you repeat it? Yeah, sorry. So I didn't hear. You started and I didn't hear anything. So can you repeat it again, please?
I was going to say we're having a wonderful time with technology today, aren't we? One of the things that occurred to me, and I think it's what Alex was saying in his presentation as well, is that the existential question really is, are we talking about this in the right way? And are we measuring this in the right way? Are we using the right metrics really to talk about the issues that are at play currently in finance? And I know you have a lot to say on this, so I am very much looking forward to your presentation. Over to you, Gavin. Hopefully I didn't freeze.
No, I heard that, Amy, and thank you very much. And obviously thank you, GEFI, for asking me to participate in this discussion today. So just to, I guess there's two questions that you posed, Amy. The first is, are we talking about this in the right way, and are we measuring things in the right way? I guess on the first point, I mean, I think Alex's comments were interesting, that we need to think about this from a qualitative perspective as opposed to pure numbers, and I guess this is the distinction between obviously, as he said, diversity and inclusion, but also representation and inclusion. And it feels like the only measure that we have right now is about representation. To an extent, I can understand like representation being the main metric that we use to measure things with some demographics. And look, I think, for example, gender, there is a long way to go regards to gender. But I can understand why some firms who feel that maybe they have a better representation of women in their firms, feeling that firstly, that's somewhat adequate. And then I can therefore understand why Alex would say, well, you can't just measure it by the numbers because you need to understand people's experiences. I guess the counter to that is, there are, and again, not to suggest that the gender case has been made and has been adhered to, but with other demographics, for example, ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ, neurodiversity, I'm not even sure we've got the representation to even start having the qualitative discussion, because the pool and the numbers of people from those demographics, particularly at the more senior, levels of organizations, are so sparse that we still need to start driving the numbers. So I just to make a distinction between this idea of qualitative versus quantitative. The other aspect of this is like, what discussion are we actually having? And again, it's a shame Alex isn't here, because I wonder what his thoughts would be on this, because I understand what he's saying, but one of the challenges that we have is how many people are you going to convince by the qualitative argument? Because as soon as you say to an individual that this is the right thing to do, or I really care about this, therefore we should do it, unfortunately gets sucked into a values and beliefs discussion. And I do think you can move part of the industry by the argument that is the moral case or the right thing to do. Unfortunately, the bulk of finance, I'm not convinced that will be the case. And the reason why I say that is because for two reasons. Firstly, the very few arguments or decisions that businesses make based on pure values and belief. There's normally some type of like bottom line attributed for that reason. And secondly, as a an ethnic minority and as a Black person, you know, the right thing to do is not, you know, it didn't happen when George Floyd was killed. The right thing to do has been prevalent for a very, very long period of time, and it hasn't worked. So I think it's very, very challenging to and I know I'm not suggesting this is purely what Alex was saying, but I do think it's challenging to say that actually maybe we need to do this on a values basis alone, because I'm not sure the majority of the industry work in that way. So this then comes to the idea around measurement and metrics, and I think the first thing you need to do is have the ability to measure. So this feels like an old chestnut that's been talked about many, many times, but we still have a data issue. And I simply feel that, you know, we need to resolve the data issue, because it's not because I don't think we can make any difference, because you can take qualitative measures, but it's still an excuse that the industry makes as to why they can't resolve the issue. So I think we need to resolve the data issue. Then there is discussion around experience, and I think that's certainly where I agree with Alex, because you don't need to know the numbers to know that if the majority of your Black or female or gay population is telling you that there is an issue, that there actually is that there is an issue. So I do think the way that we talk about this does need to change, and I think the metrics we need to, yes, gather the data, but I think we also need, and I do agree with Alex, I think there is probably some smarter ways around how we can actually understand the experience gap that a lot of these groups are still unfortunately going through.
Thanks, Gavin. I mean, it's a really interesting point. I think this debate between the qual and the quant, because on the quant we absolutely need evidence, but we need to make sure that we're tracking and tracing the right type of metrics. And you know, Alex said this in the presentation. Tracking, for example, gender to EBITDA and share price, is that actually a really robust measure? Should we be using those measures when we're talking about broader, for example, racial equity, neurodiversity, disability, sexual orientation? Are these really the types of measures that we should be looking at? And if they're not, what are the other types of measures that we can look at? Do you have any thoughts on what those can be?
Yeah, so it's very interesting that when you think about things like EBITDA, it is very much based on the outcome for the company, not based on the outcome for individuals or society. So I think there is a challenge of only looking at the outcome for society, and there's almost this view that companies operate in a vacuum, almost separate from society, when actually, they are absolutely part of society, for the simple fact that they contribute to societal outcomes, and the people that work in these firms are part of society. I mean, they're not beamed from outer space and end up in these organizations. So I do think there is discussion around what impact companies are having the other way, the impact the organizations are having on society. I also think there is then, you need to start drawing some lines between these issues. So the best example I can think of is, for example, sustainability, where it was something where it was, when I was growing up, it was Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, and it was people boarding ships in the Antarctic, and it was almost seen as a niche or marginalized movement. And how did we get from there to it being something so mainstream that like we all like play a role in the environment, and companies have to, you know, measure it as a risk. So, and it feels to me that like diversity and inclusion, this whole discussion is still in that board and ships in the Antarctic, like it's a niche. You know, there are people like us that really care about it, and people that may be curious about it, like some of the audience, but it hasn't quite yet hit the mainstream. So I do wonder, like, how do we get from that to it being just something that companies think about beyond EBITDA, just about the culture, but also their impact on those demographics. And I do come back, I think you're right, Amid, I think we do get back to the measurement. So that we measure everything. We measure, you know, climate, we measure longevity, we measure inflation, we measure, you know, there is nothing that we can't get arms around, but for some reason we don't measure essentially like inequality. And I can't imagine that actually inequality doesn't have some impact on society. Of course it does. It doesn't have an impact on economics, and therefore doesn't have an impact on companies. So like maybe there is a case to be thinking about, maybe we need to measure it's not just in terms of, you're right, companies, but also like what are we doing about deprived communities in different regions? What are we doing about underrepresented groups, and what impact do they have on society? What impact can they have on the on organizations? So that to me would start to move the discussion that companies could just understand, measure, quantify, and perhaps do something about.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very much in that vein of sort of moving from that shareholder primacy model to that stakeholder alignment model, and ensuring that we actually understand who our stakeholders are, what their needs and their aspirations are, as well as they intersect with the businesses that we're either, you know, running or working in, and then ensuring that we're able to kind of track metrics that respond to those as well. It was really interesting. It's not quite kind of what we're talking about. There was a very interesting recent study done by the University of Adelaide, again through that gender lens, so just really focusing on women, but focusing on women as a mechanism through which an organization, a corporation, can improve its risk management, and here specifically the risk management as it relates to environmental fines. And for every woman that they, with the sort of the test population they looked at, for every woman who was appointed to the board, the risk of environmental fines as a result of poor performance reduced by 1.5%. So we're starting to see some of these new sort of research programs coming through that aren't looking at, you know, sort of the very traditional sort of shareholder metrics, but saying, well, let's look at actually other measures of corporate resilience. But again, to your point, it's not really getting us to where we need to get to with regards to the stakeholder needs. I want to bring in Lynne now. So Lynne Highway, who is the Director of Colleague even experience and HR transformation at NatWest. And Lynne is responsible for looking at sort of the welfare and the well-being of 35,000 colleagues. Lynne, you know, we're talking about metrics, we're talking about, you know, reporting, we're talking about the benefits that, you know, diversity and inclusion brings to not just the corporate environment, but to society and around. You have a lot of experience, you know, working with this type of data, these types of programs, these types of approaches. How are you doing this at NatWest? What have you found works well? What have you found, you know, is challenging? It'd be really interesting to hear the sort of the NatWest perspective.
Yeah, and so first of all, thank you to GEFI for the invitation, and thanks, Amy. And really interesting to hear from both Alex and Gavin and their kind of perspectives and experiences. And I guess my first observation would be that this is just such a big topic that, you know, every conversation that I have about it, I come away a bit richer and kind of understand more. So hopefully today we'll build on that. I think for us as a group, I think the first thing is that this is a really significant area of focus for us, and has been for a number of years. And it's not just about measurement. It's integral to our purpose as being a purpose-led organisation. And it just needs that constant ongoing focus. So what I thought would be helpful would be just to bring to life some of the things that we have done and that we still have underway. This is a long journey. It's not going to happen in a month, a year, 2 years. This has to become part of the organisational DNA, and also part of the DNA of our partner organisations and our suppliers. So everything that we do, so that we are representative of the communities that we support and that we are part of. As I walk through that, though, I guess there's just a couple of caveats from me. I'm very mindful that there are people from a number of different countries here today. So very, very aware that there's different regulatory requirements, there's different social norms and very different contexts that we all operate in. So I do just want to acknowledge that, and what's possible in one country may well not be possible in another country. So that's definitely something where we have kind of presence beyond the UK that we give a lot of thought to. I think from our perspective, it's about fundamentally doing the right thing. We believe that DE&I it's fundamentally about doing the right thing, and it's really helpful to hear Alex's take on the different views about the business cases and the commerciality of it. But as a purpose-led organisation, of course, we look at the metrics. That's a key part of being an organisation. But metrics alone don't determine our priorities. And given that, when we look at this agenda, there's been 4 key areas of focus for us over recent times. And they've been informed by insights from our employee-led network. So we have 8 employee-led networks at the moment. We have inclusion champions, and we have colleague listening across the organisation. So the first area that we've really been focusing on very heavily is improving representation. And that really builds on the points that both Alex and Gavin have made around making sure that we try to reflect the diversity of our customers, our communities, and the different jurisdictions that we operate in. That's easier in some areas than in other areas, but that is a key area of focus for us. Secondly, it's about when people are here, making sure that we are inclusive and we create an inclusive environment where colleagues can bring their whole self to work, they bring the best of themselves to work, and the knowledge that we value them for who they are. And dialogue is incredibly important as part of that, and taking time to know each other. And we've had a big focus on making sure that we create a great place to work and we get to know the whole person and not just the work that they do. Thirdly, it won't surprise you to know that it's really important to meet our statutory requirements and that we go above and beyond those. And that's really important for us. And finally, as I've already said, we embed it in our strategy, ensuring that it's an expected and natural consideration for everything we do. It's just a core part of the way that we operate around here at every level in the organisation. Of course, we track our progress with that through a whole suite of diversity stats, looking at colleague sentiment through staff opinion surveys. And recently, we've been much more focused on analysing that through different lenses, through different characteristics, tied in with disclosures and the information people are willing to share with us. We also review pay gap information. That's an important thing for us to look at annually. And of course, we undertake external benchmarking to make sure we're clear about best practice, how can we learn from others, what hasn't worked so well, and also try and share what we're doing, which is one of the reasons for speaking today. In terms of kind of thinking then about how we become gender and ethnically balanced and diverse, which is the 2 areas I've been asked to focus on, although I would say that clearly those are only 2 areas. None of us are just one thing. I'm not just a woman in the workplace. There will be other characteristics about me. I will have different lived experiences. So we're very clear about not just categorising people in certain ways and thinking about the intersectionality. We have a very clear inclusion policy and we have targets around that. So we have been very clear about setting goals for our organisation and for our senior leaders around making sure that just as we track and measure a number of things, we also measure gender balance in our top 3 levels of the organisation, and we've set goals around that for 2030, but clearly we track the pipeline through to that. And also for our Black, Asian and minority ethnic colleagues, we're tracking what that looks like at the top 4 levels in the UK, and we've set a goal for 2025 of that. So very clear business goals that we're focused on, and we monitor on a quarterly basis to look at our trajectory with those. Those are all supported, Amy, by positive action approach. So we originally had that in place for gender. We've broadened that out and applied it slightly differently for our ethnicity plans, and that focuses on recruitment, advancement and retention. But to be very clear, there's no one action. I wish there was. There's no one action that delivers success. We operate in a dynamic environment. The context around us is constantly shifting and evolving, and we need to test and learn and adapt as we go with that. So those would be some of the things that we do. I've got lots more information on our positive action approach and just some of the challenges that we face in that, Amy, but I'll maybe pause there and see where you'd like me to focus.
Thank you so much, Lynne. I mean, gosh, so much going around my head at the moment. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was obviously the diversity in the policy environments. When you're an international organisation, you have huge diversity in the regulatory and policy environments that you're working within. And we know that there are issues with data collection on some of these, areas that we do need to focus on in order to redress the imbalances that reside in the heart, of the global finance system. How do you even begin to tackle that when you have got such a patchwork quilt of different types of regulatory and policy environments, and also people's willingness to want to share what is actually fundamentally quite personal data sometimes? How do you even begin to tackle that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess it continues to evolve and we're still learning around this. So one of the, clearly being clear and, very focused on the different regulatory requirements in the areas you operate on. So that's the minimum, what within the parameters of regulations and legislation is right and appropriate would be the minimum standard for us. The thing that we've done over the last couple of years to help us with that is to really start to do a better job. There's more for us to do in helping to our colleagues understand why we're asking for that information and what we're going to use it for. So building trust, building understanding, so that people understand how we will use the information they share with us to inform our plans and inform our approach, and that we only want people to share things that they're comfortable with sharing. The other thing that we've done as an organisation is we established a multicultural network that really focused in on having different conversations, and we involved and engaged them along with some of our other employee-led networks to understand their perspectives, to get them to have a conversation as well about the benefits that they see, but also the challenges that they see. Where appropriate, get them to advocate for and with us, but also challenge us as an organisation and help us work through some of the conundrums. And that's really helped us very significantly, particularly in the UK, where we have seen our disclosure rates rise very significantly on the back of that. Ultimately, I think it comes down to trust. I think colleagues have to trust why you're asking for that information and see that you're using it responsibly. We've also done a piece of work last year where we shared a bit of an infographic with our colleagues around how we use the information, and we reassured them about their privacy and our commitments to them about their privacy. And we are hugely protective of who gets access to what, making sure we're GDPR compliant, and also that it's the right thing to do. So massive area of focus. In other countries, we use the local teams, we're informed by them, we use their expertise, we're guided by them. We take input from them on where can we help with the wider debate about what could and should and shouldn't be done in those countries to help move the agendas forward. But we absolutely draw on their knowledge and expertise, and we're very clear it can't be one size fits all. What happens in one country and is socially acceptable and legally okay in one country may not be in another. So we have to be much more thoughtful about how we approach that.
Have you found there has been any resistance to this, very comprehensive program of work that you've been overseeing? Has there been resistance either within the bank or from your own, shareholders? Although obviously that includes us all.
Yes.
But have you felt or have you witnessed any resistance from any of your stakeholder communities to this type of approach to managing your footprint, your D&I footprint?
I think it's back to one of the points that was made earlier. Actually, this is about people's beliefs. It's about people's experiences. So it's a change in behaviour, it's a change in culture, it's a change in mindset, not for everybody, but different people will start at different places. So for some people that this does feel, maybe I've certainly observed some people being really uncomfortable. It's not that they don't agree with it. And one of the things that we've done to overcome that, and I've personally benefited from, is reciprocal mentoring, where I've been mentored by colleagues who have disabilities, or I've been mentored by a couple of our Black colleagues very recently, where it's a safe environment to ask questions that you might not feel okay asking, and to build that understanding. So some of it's about people feeling a bit uncomfortable, not because they disagree with the direction, but what is it okay to say? What is it okay to ask? What isn't it? There's a perennial debate about goals and targets, and is that the right thing to do? Is that the right way to go? That's not unique to this topic. You could apply that across many things. But overall, I think there is an increasing acceptance, understanding, and awareness. But it's not without its challenges. I think we would all openly acknowledge that, and that's why the tone from the top is incredibly important, and being consistent and rigorous about it, and giving people the tools to kind of just feel more comfortable about it. But this is part of a wider societal change. This is not just about our organisation, and that helps.
No, absolutely. I'm gonna ask Gavin to come back in again so we can start a bit more of a conversation. Also, because I know, Gavin, we spoke last week about the need to ensure that the environments that are being created are as much about retention as they are about recruitment as well. And I think, listening to Lynne and what Lynne and her teams have been doing at NatWest obviously is very, very comprehensive. But Gavin, in your experience, having spent obviously your career in finance, but also being the co-founder of the Talk About Black movement, what has worked well, do you think, in finance, and what hasn't worked well?
So, yeah, I mean, I first and foremost, I do agree there is the problem is multifaceted. So we have an attraction problem, first and foremost. I know there have been great attempts to increase the number of applicants to the finance industry. I mean, things like 10,000 black interns that a lot of people are aware of. It's a great example. I guess one of the issues is that it's much easier to bring people in at the junior level. One of the how do you attract people at the more senior level? And I know the typical response is, well, the talent isn't there, but I mean there are lists every year, the Black British Business Awards, the Power Lists, and the names change every year, and they've been going for 10, 15 years. Talent does exist. The question is, why isn't that talent being attracted to the industry? So it's probably the first point. The second point is, I think a lot of the challenges that I think minorities face often start presenting themselves before they even think about working in the industry. So I think, for example, the Black community, there's a socioeconomic, not all of it, but many parts of it, the socioeconomic deprivation is very, very prevalent in that community. There is another performance in education, and you can, blame the kids or blame the education, but there is the reality is that there is an underperformance in education, and there's also an affordability issue with the young people not wanting to go to university because they grow up without money, the thought of incurring more debt and working in an industry that might not want them. A lot of them don't want to go to university, yet we still only recruit people from university. So before, I think for many demographics, before they even start applying, they are challenged, and that can be 18 years, 16, 21 years of your life before you even apply. Some firms have therefore started to, for example, recruit diverse talent and hire contextually, but we have an issue because they might hire diverse talent, but we don't manage diverse talent, because what happens is the talent gets into organizations and then it has to adapt and apply itself to a very monolithic culture, and that culture is not one which has been created by those groups. So what happens is they are told things like, well, you don't quite fit, or you need to take the right feedback, or you need to be more this and more that, and it gets to a point, and I know through personal experience, where you change so much that you start to reject it because you simply cannot change anymore, and that's simply why we see and it isn't ability, because if you can navigate a difficult environment and get to the industry, you've got the ability to perform well in this industry. And in fact, I would say the skills that these groups have developed are probably highly valuable and should be highly sought after, but we don't utilize them. So what happens is that those groups feel disaffected. They don't perform as well. They don't apply for the next roles. They start looking for a way out, and you just get higher rates of attrition. So it's all very well bringing that talent in at the early levels, but if it drops off by the 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 year mark, which is where I am, then something is going wrong. And I think that's the case across every facet of our industry, from consultancy to asset management, banking, tech, any law firms, anything associated with finance. I think that is a trend. I don't think anyone has really been able to rectify that as yet. You then asked what are firms doing better. I do think, look, at least the issue is now on the agenda. Before, the reason why we launched Talk About Black is because no one wanted to talk about it. So we called it Talk About Black. In fact, it was still called BAME. It was still very much a taboo subject. When I was even, if I felt I was subject to something that might be due to my race, the discussion was shut down before it even started. So there was never any ability or pathway to address the issue. So I do think the industry is willing now to at least talk about it. I do think that certainly a lot of pledges and statements have been made. I do think that there's even been money applied to, for example, philanthropic and social impact initiatives. I do think that a lot of firms now have launched DE&I strategies or have DE&I professionals that are full-time, that focus on this issue full-time. And I do think that companies recognize whether there's whether it's the right thing to do or not, I do think they realize that actually there's representation issue and they need to fix it. So I do think the industry has come a long way, but I guess it comes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the discussion, the second point, which is the culture and the environment and inclusivity. That's the bit where I now think we really need to pay some attention to, because you can create a DE&I strategy, you can put a HR policy in place, but the question is, how much is it really moving the dial when it comes to these groups? And the evidence would suggest that we've still got some way to go.
It's a really interesting reflection, because as a woman and as a climate and soil scientist by training, and having spent my career in sustainability, it's taken a long time for the discussion around true sustainability to really sort of bed itself down in business. We're a lot further on than we were when I first started 30 years ago. Gender, we're like, to Lynne's point, we're a lot further on than where we were 30 years ago as well. When you consider that fundamentally the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and within that human rights crisis it's a racial equity and equality crisis, what do you think when we're talking sort of specifically around racial equity and racial equality, we can learn from the climate crisis and the way that that is being addressed in all its kind of glory and inglorious presentation at the moment as well. What do you think we can learn from that may help us move the needle further and faster on racial, equity and equality, but all forms of diversity and inclusion? Is there anything that you've sort of witnessed that you've thought, this is great, this is a door that we can use, we can go through this door and use the same approach?
Yes, there are a few things. So the first is I probably alluded to this a bit earlier, which is the ability to measure. But the interesting thing is, because until like net zero targets were established, until we knew, we had this idea of carbon emissions, it's very difficult to establish an outcome, either by, reducing climate carbon emissions or achieving a target temperature. So I do think we need to measure, but the key thing is, what are we measuring? Because a lot of the time the discussion really is about like racism and discrimination, and the question is, how do you measure it? So the reduction, and we should absolutely fight racism. I've been a victim of it overtly and more subtly, and it is dehumanizing, and we do need to overcome that. But there's another issue here around our socioeconomic position, the role and status that we have in society, which is certainly a lot to do with that. Is a lot of that is racism, but there is also how do we actually, how does the Black community empower itself first and foremost? And also, if we work in finance, which is fundamentally meant to be about wealth creation, then how do we create wealth? Because I think a lot of the issues, the challenges that the community faces, a lot of it is due to not just racism, but the racial wealth gap which exists. So high rates of unemployment, health inequality, underperformance in education. A lot of these are outcomes of an economic issue. And racism is certainly partly an economic construct. So some of the focus really needs to be on actually, how do we reduce that wealth gap? How do we create housing, financial literacy, community? There's an amazing stat from the US, which basically says that $1 stays in the Black community for a total of six hours before it leaves the Black community. It's obviously in the US. Whereas in other demographics, Asian, Jewish, white American, it's days. I mean, it's up to 28 days, 23 days, etc. So this idea of economic empowerment, that, and that's where I would love to see the focus, and have a target and have a strategy for getting there. It won't remove racism, but at least it might mitigate some of the impact that racism and socioeconomic status has in the Black community.
Yeah, absolutely, and a really, really, really comprehensive answer there. And I'm going to come on to the Q&A that are being posed in a minute, but it segues really nicely to a question that I wanted to pose Lynne, actually. How much of the work that you're doing, Lynne, focusing across the business as you do and across these multiple jurisdictions as you do as well, how much of the fantastic work that you're doing is then being referenced by the investment teams who are going out and taking positions in publicly listed, privately owned companies? How much of what you're doing is then being taken up and saying, okay, well, look, we know this works, and this works, in the context of our business. We want to see the same now being executed in the context of the business within which we're now obviously holding a stake. Do you have that level of kind of engagement and kind of interactivity between the sort of the commercial investment teams and then the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is absolutely. So if you think about it, I've focused very much today on kind of the colleague side of things, but clearly from a customer and a partner and supplier and investor, you know, all of our stakeholders. This is a huge agenda item. And, you know, we just recently communicated, just at the end of last week, we announced our annual results, and in our annual report and accounts, that this is talked about in detail. You know, it's spoken about extensively. I mentioned earlier about the multicultural network, and they've done a lot of research, and we've published that. You know, that's not something we've just held internally. We're very open about that, just as we've gone ahead with gender pay reporting and ethnicity pay reporting. We're being very open in disclosing that. When we're working with suppliers, so I met with one of our partner organisations a few weeks ago, and we did have a conversation about purpose, sustainability. Where are they with their DE&I agenda? So it's integral in all of that. And all investors, you know, whether it's DE&I, whether it's sustainability in its broadest sense, these things are massively up on the agenda. One of the things that we have also been doing is sharing quite openly some of the learnings and the progress we're making with many of our customers and clients, so that we learn from each other and benefit as well. So it's not just investors, it's about trying to help maybe businesses that are just evolving, some entrepreneurs thinking about some of the things they do through our Accelerate programme, but also having the much more strategic conversations with our investors, analysts and businesses that we support. So I think this is just an integral and core part of the agenda anymore. I don't think you could not talk about it.
I totally agree with you, Lynne. I'm sure, and I think we could probably all name at least a couple of people who choose not to talk about it. We need to engage with them and bring them on. Great question, actually, within the Q&A. We've seen obviously the fairly fast development and deployment of the task force for climate-related financial disclosure. We are awaiting the first draft of a framework for coming from the task force for nature-related financial disclosure. Question: could we, or should we even, see a task force for socially related financial disclosures? Do you think having a framework that becomes a regulatory requirement in finance for socially related financial disclosures, do you think that would help or hinder the work that needs to be undertaken? Lynne, I'll ask you that first.
I was hoping you'd go to Gavin on that.
I can go to Gavin.
I mean, my personal point of view is I think the more that we disclose information and have the dialogue, the better. But I will defer to Gavin on that one, if that's okay.
Gavin, over to you. What do you think about a task force on socially related financial disclosures?
Well, I think it's actually happening. I think the regulator, the FCA, has made its intention very clear to ask companies to start disclosing their ethnic, social mobility makeup. So I do think it's coming. Whether it's to companies or investments is probably something that will come out in the details. So I do think this is happening, and they've been very forthright in making it clear that this is the direction of travel. So whoever posed that question, I think you can rest assured that I do think it's coming. I think the interesting thing here, however, is just what are the catalysts for change, and there are a few. So one is absolutely the regulator, and I think we will begin to, or we are going to see that. I don't know what time frame, but I think we will. Secondly, I mean, you may have like a leader or someone on the C-suite that feels very passionately about this and can drive that change in the organization. I've seen established organizations do this, but also new organizations like yours, Amy, that put this in their, obviously in their constitution. Society can have that impact as well. Societal pressure, just look at the impact that certain figures in society have had on the climate agenda, and it can come from clients and customers. So certainly in the asset management industry, there was an asset owner group who issued something called a diversity charter, and they are a group of very influential pension funds and corporate institutional investors, and they have started to hold the asset managers to account over diversity and disclosure and inclusion. So I do actually think these things are happening. It obviously takes some time to get some momentum. Of course, I think most people would say that it's much better for firms to get there by themselves rather than having these outside forces. But as I said earlier, I think if this was going to happen organically, it probably would have happened. If firms are going to come to realization spontaneously, it probably would have happened already. So I suspect these catalysts are really required.
Brilliant, thank you, Gavin. Question for you both, although Lynne, you might want to answer this one first, just given what you're doing. Really, really interesting, actually. Really, I think quite a profound question in many ways. How do you ensure that schemes like reciprocal mentoring don't actually demand too much emotional labour from what are already quite vulnerable communities or groups?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think there is a real risk of that if it's not thought through well and carefully. Certainly from my experience, that when we approach reciprocal mentoring, what's worked well for us is it's entirely voluntary. So people who want to be mentored volunteer, the people who want to mentor volunteer. So there is no requirement or expectation. And what we've done really well up front is contract around what do both parties want to get from it, where are the boundaries, and it's time bound, so it's not going to go on for years. We tend to say 6 months and then review. And actually, I think it's about just that open dialogue. So, for example, one of the reciprocal mentoring conversations I had, or one of the relationships I had, was around the time of when England were playing football last year, and there was all the horrific stuff that was going on there. And we spoke about how that made him feel, but also how we were responding to that as an organisation. So I think it's about, and that was a really helpful conversation for both of us, to build that understanding and how we both felt about it, and also what more the organisation could do around that in terms of our culture. And we were very clear about our stance and our view on that, as an example. I think in terms of the vulnerability as well, I would like to think that there's benefit for the mentors. So for the individuals who've mentored me, they've got the opportunity to maybe experience some different things and broaden their network and have different conversations to the ones they might have had in previous in the past. But also, they've been able to come along to other forums and talk about things. They've helped inform policies and processes, but it's about as much as they want to give. There is no time requirement. There's no expectation. It really is just about two people having a conversation and respecting the boundaries. And if it's going too far, then we have those open, honest conversations. But I think we do need to be aware of it and not make assumptions. But it's been hugely beneficial for both parties, is the assessment that we have. But you can't go into it gently. I think you have to be very thoughtful about it.
Mm. I mean, Gavin, what's your perspective on it? Because I imagine you probably get asked a lot of time to share your experiences. What's it been like for you as a Black man in finance in the UK? Does it get to the stage sometimes where it actually becomes, it feels like it's becoming a burden for you in terms of, the constant demands for you to have to explain to other people what it feels like? I'm really interested here in your sort of personal experience and how you respond and deal with what must be, quite a pressurized emotional environment when you're explaining what it's like.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, the first pressure comes from, to be honest, just being a black person, black male in finance. So I've had conversations, particularly with Black women, because they're often held up as the, right in the crosshairs of, being the most challenged. They're women and they're Black. And I think there was a view that as a man, at least, you don't have to deal with the gender issue, but which I don't. But the odd thing about it is that unfortunately, there's a stereotype of Black men, which I kind of have to fight against daily. So it's very actually difficult for me to be my full self, to be a full male, because I need to be careful that I don't come across as too aggressive. I need to be careful that I, smile all the time. I have to dress as smartly as possible, because people will immediately jump to a conclusion, and that's unfortunately has been a trait that I've had to fight against my whole career. So I would say that just even being a Black professional in the industry is exhausting. So yeah, of course, then when you throw in this extra responsibility, then it only amplifies it. I think again, it's particularly acute when you're senior Black professional, because you are visible. I mean, just being a senior professional is challenging. Being a senior minority professional is challenging. The reason why I spoke out about against these things is because no one else was. There wasn't anyone more senior than me, and this was 5 years ago when I wasn't that senior, and I'm, relatively speaking, still not that senior. So if I didn't say anything, then these issues would go unsaid. And honestly, it was either that or really have a think about whether this industry is for me or not. I decided to do something about it. But yes, I mean, I have been asked to do a lot. I still get asked to do a lot. I now say no to most things, because the mental health tax is significant. So I'm glad the person asked that question, because I think most people will like index towards like people in my situation and me, without really understanding that their one ask actually is probably 10 that you receive that month. And then you have the challenge of like, well, what do you say yes to? Who do you say no to? So yes, I also think that, just perhaps speaking a bit more broadly, that I think we often find that it's often the minorities that are also leading the cultural and diversity change. It's no coincidence that, I don't know if it's the majority, but whenever I look at the lists of diversity and inclusion professionals, they all seem to be Black women. There's a huge predominance of black women. Obviously, the network's incredibly important, but the networks obviously are a guide and a buffer to other, Black professionals in an organization. But the key question is, what support are the leads of those networks getting? Because they are also the lightning rod for anything that the organization might want to do, for anything, any challenges that arise. I would say that if you're going to put minorities in that situation, you need to give them some mental health support as well. Give them a coach as part of the package to help them deal with the extra burden that they are facing. Would be my suggestion, because it is very, very significant, very significant.
That actually leads in really nicely to another question, and thank you, Gavin, so much for sharing that as well. Lynne, when we're talking about neurodiversity as well, where there is, often some quite significant vulnerabilities because they're potentially less socially comfortable. They have less sort of comfort being in social situations than we do. They think differently. They think very, very differently a lot of the time. How do you manage then the potential burden that may be placed on them, similar to Gavin as well? But then how do you also create that space in what are often very, very busy, chaotic environments? How do you create the space to enable those who are neurodiverse to really thrive?
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, it's an area that we've been focusing on a lot more, I would say, over the last few years. and it's a fascinating area because it's so broad, and we need to think about it in every sense. So if we think about neurodiversity in terms of mental health and how we support people through that, and the open dialogue, you know, the huge progress that's been made with discussion about mental health, but still much more to do. So we had a big programme about Let's Talk About Mental Health, where literally over the space of a year, we saw a massive shift in terms of people openly sharing, talking about their experiences, and that's been hugely important to us and beneficial. We're continuing with that. If I think about it from a recruitment perspective, if we start there, recruitment and attraction in terms of neurodiversity, really thinking much more creatively about the selection processes organisations use, you know, the accessibility around that, what it is we are looking for, the different characteristics and the respective strengths that different people bring, where we're looking at neurodiversity, rather than expecting everyone to tick every possible category or box, looking at the particular strengths that those individuals can bring. So the recruitment is one big area that we've been focusing on. And then linked to that, we've actually just been doing some partnerships in the last year or so, trying to bring, it was actually focusing on autism and bringing people in who maybe wouldn't have ordinarily found their environment the easiest to work in, just because of the different, you know, the different surroundings, and working with a partner organisation to, you know, just experience what we needed to change, and that's worked very well for us. So learning through that. I think recent changes to the ways people work is something that we're still considering. So people working from home more. I'm in the office today. It's much noisier. So actually thinking about how will our colleagues with neurodiversity adapt to that as we evolve our ways of working is another big area of focus, and how do we support that? So I think it's about respecting different strengths, focusing on those strengths, making sure you cater for them all the way through, and just again build the understanding and awareness, but a massive area of focus because so much talent that organisations can benefit from in that population.
Thank you. I'm very aware of the time, and there's one. I mean, I could sit and talk to you both for hours, and I'm sure everybody listening could sit and talk with you both for hours. One final question that has been posed: which, if either, is most important, do you think, as we seek to tackle kind of the systemic issues around diversity and inclusion, not just in finance, in business, and in society more broadly? Looking at our own operations within businesses and the environments that we create within our own businesses, or as investors and as contractors, i.e., you know, thinking about the suppliers that we have through the investments that we make, and, you know, potentially within that, you know, the supply chain, the investments that we're making there. Which, if either, do you think is most additive as we seek to tackle kind of the systemic nature of the inequality that we're facing? And Gavin, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and obviously the right answer is both, of course, but that's too short to say. I mean, I think I think again I alluded to this in my opening remarks, that companies, and forget about, you know, Milton Friedman and stakeholder capitalism. The reality is companies are part of society for reasons I already explained, because they contribute economically. People who work in those companies work in societies, so are part of society. So I just don't think you can look at organizations in a vacuum, unless you draw your population from a very small strata of society, which I think is the issue. The second point to this is that a lot of organizations are unwilling to make statements regarding, for example, supply or value chains or clients or customers, because they feel that, well, how can I demand that they have better representation, more inclusive, if we are not? So that's a second issue. I think actually perhaps the best way to get, for organizations to get their internal operations is to actually affect the ecosystem. It's probably the best way, because even if you even if you were to, for example, kind of what Alex was alluding to, even if you were to do really, really good job and attract a whole bunch of neurodiverse people, people with disabilities, physical disabilities, LGBTQ+, even if you were to attract a lot of them to your organization, all that you may have done is just attracted those individuals to your organization. What you really need to think about is how you actually affect their role in society, how they get to your firm, what experience they have in your business, and also when they leave, so they can contribute more. So my view would be that you need to actually, by affecting the spheres in which you operate, firms will increase their own chances of getting the internal bit right.
Thanks, Gavin. Lynne, I'm curious as to whether you're going to agree or whether you're going to disagree.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I think it has to be about an integrated approach, and I guess I come back to where I started, which is it has to be part of the purpose of the organisation, and whether that that's purpose for the individuals who work in and with the organisation, or whether that's the wider environment that organisation interacts with. I think it has to be both. If you don't do it in your own operations, in your own team, how can you possibly have a mandate to talk to others about that? So, but I think both have to move. And finally, for me, it isn't just about the numbers. It's about how inclusive the organisation is. It's not just about hitting those numbers and having positive evidence of that through in partnerships with others.
Lynne, Gavin, thank you, and Alex as well. Obviously, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdoms and your insights and your lived-in experience as well with us. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to the three of you, learning lots along the way as well, which is always a good thing. I think, as we look out to the future and the future society and the future businesses that we need to build, it's clear that we've come some way. We've come, further in some areas than we have in others. There's still a lot of work to do to create the type of work environments that reflect the communities that we want and we choose to live, work and play in, the communities that we need as well. But there are some great insights that you have shared that help us navigate some of the pitfalls, as well as embrace some of the opportunities. So to you both, thank you so much. And Alex, if you're watching this on the recorded playback, when you are watching this, I should say, Alex, on the recorded playback, thank you very, very much for your insights as well. And the GEFI team, thank you so much for putting this together as well. As always, your events are so enlightening and inspiring. On that note, next week, we actually have the launch of GEFI's new Scottish Task Force for Green and Sustainable Financial Services. So the work that GEFI has been doing to kickstart that, which is incredibly exciting. So I would really, really urge everybody on the call still to tune into that next week, the details of which are actually on the GEFI website. And as I just mentioned, the recording of this will be made available after this. So thank you to everybody for taking the time out of your probably very, very hectic and busy diaries today to join us. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm sorry we can't and we didn't get the chance to cover absolutely everything. As you know, it's a huge, huge subject, but stay safe and well, everybody. Stay out of the wind. I believe we have another storm possibly on the way, and just take care of yourselves. Thank you.